thing on this. My name is Brian Manley. Peter King, a writer for Sports Illustrated, in the June 2010 issue, had this to say about fantasy football. Fantasy football may not be the real thing, but it still demands extensive study and ongoing research, end quote. With the growing popularity of fantasy football and the growing revenue it produces, it only makes sense that the National Football League put on a 24/7, year-round network show dedicated solely to fantasy football. American football is the most popular sport in the U.S., so a 24-hour or a 24/7 network would do well. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how popular fantasy football is, how there is a market for a 24/7 network, and how easy it would be for the NFL to actually set that up because half the work's already done. So let's start off by discussing how popular fantasy football is. Now, if you go to Google and you type in fantasy football in the search bar, you're going to get over 122 million hits. Now, according to an article written by Nate Siegel for Quicken Loans in the October 2012 issue entitled 5 Shocking Numbers Behind the Fantasy Football Industry, the Fantasy Football Trade Association said there were 25.8 million people who played fantasy football just this last year, and that's in the U.S. alone. If you count Canada, you're getting to closer to actually 30 million people that have played. Here I've got a graph that shows you some of these are some of the demographics of the people that actually play fantasy football. And one of the largest demographics is actually the 18 and under crowd, which is good because, as you can see, the top #1 thing is most people play for 8.5 years. You can see they spend on average of $467 per year playing fantasy football. I can tell you I played for 11 years. I've been a commissioner in my league for 11 years, so most of the people that play in my league have been there for the last 9, some of them for the entire 11 years. So people stay playing. They stay on it. They really like it. You can see the average household income is very high, so they have that expendable income that they can use to spend on fantasy sports type things. Now, an interview by Dan Evans on PC Magazine took a quote from ESPN Vice President of Gaming, Ralph Pollock, and he said, quote, "Fantasy football is becoming more and more prominent throughout ESPN," end quote. So there are more organizations than just the NFL that are getting into fantasy football. Now, since we're done talking about the popularity of fantasy football, let's talk about the 24/7 network and the ways it could actually generate real dollars. The popularity of online-based gaming and fantasy football and fantasy sports has gone up tremendously. There are actually other businesses besides just hosting networks. There are actually fantasy player insurance, which I'm not going to go too long into these, but if your entry fee into your league costs $100, you can pay a insurance company $10 to insure your starting player, your best player. And if your best player gets injured, like Tom Brady did 3 or 4 years ago in the first game, you get that $100 back. So people, as crazy as it may sound, people have actually are generating businesses because of this. There's fantasy football judges who will come in and you can issue what the problem was in your league or the dispute. They'll actually, oversee that. They'll make a judgment call. I can tell you disputes happen all the time. And there are companies who specialize in fantasy football trophies and that instant. All those have been grown up because of fantasy sports, in particular fantasy football. Now, and this is some of the revenue that it's actually produced in millions of dollars. Now 2013 was actually projected because this was written in 2013, but you can see the millions of dollars that are in fantasy sports and fantasy football. Now, according to an article published in September 2012 in the Sports Business Daily by Eric Fisher, the NFL, the number of people playing fantasy football grew by over 40% from 2012 to 2013, which is huge. Now, competition from other fantasy hosting sites is very intense. You've got ESPN that does it, CBS Sports, Yahoo, and numerous other ones. So a 24/7 network could give the NFL an edge over their competition. Now, clearly there's a market for everything fantasy football, but the best thing is that half the work's already done for the NFL. There's an NFL Red Zone that's on where you subscribe to it. It's got its own channel, but it only comes on at the beginning of beginning of football season, and it ends at the end of end of football season. And you subscribe to it, pay so much money. They've already got that, and then of course they've got the NFL Network channel that's on. But they've got the NFL Red Zone, and I realize that only takes up time for the actual football season, and what are you going to do the rest of the time during the 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But there are numerous fantasy football shows that the NFL already produces, Fantasy Live. There's just lots and lots of them that they could put and generate into their own network show. They could even show different things like the fantasy football player's best year, those type things. So there's lots of show ideas for a year-round network that the NFL could do. So there you have it. A year-round network would be a good idea. With the growing popularity of fantasy football and the growing revenue it produces, the National Football League could use its unlimited resources to produce a year-round network dedicated to fantasy football news. As you can see, fantasy football is popular. There's a growing demand for it, for anything fantasy football related, and the NFL has the tools and experience or expertise needed to produce the show. With that said, I would urge the NFL to jump on this and do a year-round network before some place like ESPN or CBS or any of those other competitors do. Thank you. We just hit that red button, big.